Hi guys, it's Mr. Y. Today we're going to be talking about animal behavior. Now, a bit of clarification. The chapter in your book that deals with this may be either chapter 33 or 34, depending on your text. I believe for most of you it'll be 33. And another clarification, animal behavior actually goes by its own scientific name called ethology. I think I'm pronouncing that right. That's not to be confused with entomology, which is the study of insects specifically. So this is behavior. This is for scientists who study specifically insects. All right, so behavior is defined as the way an organism reacts to changes in its environment. So keywords here are react to changes. Now, in any type of behavior, two key parts you want to make sure you're clear on, and that is the stimulus and the response. The stimulus is a signal of some kind that carries detectable information. Now, that can be through any of the five senses, of course: sound, sight, sight, taste, touch, excuse me, and smell, or what we call chemical sense. The response is the reaction to that stimulus. So this set of baby geese here, the stimulus they see is their parent geese, their mother geese, swimming away, and their response, their reaction to that stimulus instinctually is to follow them in a nice straight line. With these two pictures here on the right, the initial stimulus could be seen as the ray of sun, thus causing a response by all these dogs here and here to go ahead and lie down and warm themselves in the sun. So we're going to discuss two general categories of behaviors. First, we're going to be talking about innate behaviors, and then we're going to be talking about learned behaviors. Innate behaviors don't really change. So these are things that don't change very easily, if at all. Whereas learned behaviors are a bit more flexible because they are learned. So while I will be discussing both, I tend to find the learned behaviors to be a bit more interesting. So innate behaviors are what you could call instinctive or inborn behaviors, behaviors where the animal knows the behavior prior to actually ever doing it, meaning to say without any previous experience to the stimulus in which causes the behavior, they can actually respond the first time very easily. One obvious example, for instance, is dogs knowing how to bark at anything that disturbs them, like snakes or intruders or anything like that. That is an instinctual response to any type of uncertainty for most dogs. Salmon, for instance, knowing to swim upstream is not something they've ever learned to do. It's not something they do frequently. They do it once in the course of their lifetime, and they always do it in the exact stream that they're born. This is considered an instinctive behavior or an innate behavior. There's many other examples. For instance, this frog here, if it perceives what it thinks to be food or potential food source, its innate response is to shoot out its tongue to try and catch it. Now, nobody's taught the frog. It didn't learn this behavior from its parents. It instinctively does this as a response to a stimulus of there potentially being a food source, in this case, this cricket. Innate behaviors often carry with them adaptive value. That's why they are innate. They can carry adaptive value in getting food. So, for instance, many spider species will actually know instinctually how to make a spider web nice and neat and organized, as you can see here in this picture, without any prior experience or having learned from any parent at all. Avoiding predators, so we'll talk about this more with the fight or flight response or the freeze response. Many species have an innate response to hide themselves very well from certain predators, to hide themselves in certain locations and using certain methods. Caring for young is often considered to be instinctual at a very basic level. I've already talked to you guys many times about mother crocodiles. Caring for the young, they'll carry them in their mouth, and this is again considered an instinctive behavior. They've never been taught this. Finding different types of shelter in certain cases, or even attracting mates, can often be born out of basic innate behaviors that are common within various species. I can think of the peacocks as a species that have an innate behavior for flashing their lovely pretty feathers for the males towards the rather drab females. So all innate behaviors should carry with them some type of adaptive value that enable an increased chance at either survival or reproduction. So underneath innate behaviors, you can consider automatic responses. These would include things like reflexes, from when, say, the doctor hits you with that little rubber mallet on your knee and your leg automatically kicks up. Often there's no conscious control over this. Another thing that you can consider within this is what we call the fight or flight or freeze response. It used to be just the fight or flight response, but many mammals especially, and a certain degree of reptiles too, will have this response where if they are suddenly startled, one of three things can potentially happen. They can get into an aggressive stance, which is what happens many times with, for instance, dogs. They can suddenly, if they're a small prey species, generally speaking, they'll suddenly perhaps either run away very, very quickly, or they may in fact freeze, hoping that by freezing they are not noticed. So it used to be just the fight or flight response. We know there's now this additional behavior as well with this. Another instinctual behavior that's considered innate that you may or may not be familiar with if you have younger siblings is grasping in primates. All babies, even when they're first born, know how to grasp. And this is not just in humans, this is in any type of higher apes. And probably is with monkeys as well, I believe. Grasping is considered an innate response. Another type of innate behavior is what we call a fixed action pattern. These are quick automatic responses to a stimulus, and once the animal recognizes the stimulus, the behavior itself will continue until all parts of the behavior are accomplished. This can be seen with mating displays or territorial displays with the betta fish here, which are very aggressive towards one another in terms of the males, even when they're not in the same tank. That's why they can't be in the same tank. They'll often continually get into this aggressive situation where they'll cause each other harm if they're kept in the same tank. Another interesting one that we've done experiments with is a fixed action pattern with geese here, where scientists noticed that if a geese spots an egg just outside the nest, it will take its bill, waddle over, and then use its bill to kind of roll the egg back. And so what they ended up experimenting with was what happened when they just kept adding eggs. And every time they put an egg on just on the outside of the nest, the geese continually used its bill to roll the egg back. And here's how you know it's a fixed action pattern, because what they ended up doing is putting an egg, and I think they put a string on it or something like that, something to pull it away, because the geese went out, began to use its bill, bad bill here, to roll it back. They pulled the egg away, completely out of range of the geese, and the geese actually continued the entire process of rolling the egg back, even though the egg was no longer there. So that's how you know it's a fixed action pattern, because the behavior continues until all parts are accomplished. Now we're going to be talking about learned behaviors. Again, these are a lot more flexible than innate behaviors, and flexible in the fact that these behaviors can change due to practice or experience for the animal. This allows the animals to adapt to changing environments. And you can find lots of examples of this, and we're going to talk about 4 subcategories of learned behavior, but some basic examples. Blue jays will often try and eat insects, including butterflies, but of course not all butterflies are edible. Things like the monarch butterfly are highly toxic to birds, whereas things like the viceroy butterfly, which looks very similar to the monarch, is non-toxic. So the blue jays have to really be paying attention to the patterns of the butterfly wings to recognize, okay, this butterfly is toxic, I shouldn't be eating it, otherwise it's going to make me sick, or this butterfly is non-toxic based upon its color. So a lot of times we see this increased flexibility with creatures who have a very generalized diets. They're not what we would call the specialist diets. So for instance, koalas. Koalas are very specialized in their diets. They have to learn how to climb a tree. They have to learn how to recognize which eucalyptus leaves, because that's all they eat, which eucalyptus leaves are ripe and which ones are not for eating. But that's about the limit of what they have to learn. They don't have to deal with any other type of food source other than those eucalyptus leaves and learning how to climb, get to them, and which ones are ripe or not. But that's about it. So you don't see a lot of dazzling behaviors out of things like koalas, whereas you can find some very interesting learned behaviors from things like bears here, who have a very broad general diet. They seem to have a greater capacity for learning new things than, say, koalas. Now, we know, for instance, that black bears in park areas have, in fact, learned to target minivans, not cars, but specifically minivans for raiding food, because minivans usually have families. Families usually bring an excess amount of food with them to feed all the different members. So the bears have actually learned the stimulus of, oh, not only is this a car, this is a specific type of car, and this specific type of car typically has more food than even any other type of car would. So learned behaviors are often associated with, or more greatly with, creatures who have a much broader diet as opposed to creatures who are very specific with the foods they eat. Now, there's 4 types of learning we're going to talk about on the following slides. They are habituation, classical conditioning, or classic conditioning. If you want to say classical conditioning, it's the same thing. Operant conditioning, and insight learning. So the first type of learned behavior we're going to talk about is habituation, and this is when an animal becomes so used to a stimulus that it no longer chooses to respond to that stimulus, even without even thinking about it. You can see this in humans, especially humans who live in dense urban areas, big cities. They'll often say, if you ask them, that they basically don't notice all the noise, the racket of the city, the bustle of the city anymore because they've simply been there too long. They've become habituated to it. We also see this a lot with zoo situations, animals in a zoo who will basically ignore all the zoo patrons who walk by any of their display areas, but of course they won't ignore the feeders of the zoo, because that's how they get their food system. So habituation, when an animal no longer responds to a stimulus, usually because that stimulus is essentially neutral to it. It does not impact in any way its survival or its reproduction, so habituation tends to happen. The gorillas here in this picture are from an eco tour. So these are tourists taking photos of wild gorillas, but the gorillas have seen this eco tour go by so many times they basically ignore the people because they're not in any way detrimental to their survival nor their reproduction. So the gorillas have basically become habituated to the presence of humans passing by. So the next type of learned behavior we're going to talk about is called classical conditioning, or classic conditioning. It's the same thing. The definition seems a bit weird, but I will go through and explain all the parts of it. It's the pairing of an unconditioned stimulus with a neutral stimulus to eventually produce a conditioned response. And a lot of times this can be seen as kind of a manipulation of an innate behavior system. So let me explain how this works. I'm going to use the classic experiment by which the gentleman who's credited with coining the term classic conditioning ran. His name was Pavlov. There were other biologists and scientists who had come across this before but hadn't really recorded it or done experimentations on it, so they're not credited with it. Pavlov's the one who gets the credit for classic conditioning, typically speaking. So what he noticed was with dogs here, whenever you showed a dog a food source, if it was especially hungry, it would salivate. It would begin to drool. This is what we called a unconditioned stimulus, UCS here, and an unconditioned response. The dog sees the food, begins to salivate as a response. Now, he then began his experiment, and what he initially did was he would ring a bell. Now, the dog itself typically didn't have a response to this other than to probably, tilt its head sideways once it saw the bell and say, why is this thing making noise? There's no real response, and it would quickly become habituated to hearing the noise of the bell if he did it often enough. Then what Pavlov did is he connected this unconditioned stimulus, the food, and at the same time he presented the food, he would ring the bell. Now the bell is the neutral stimulus. Again, the dog knows this bell is neither helpful nor hurtful, it's just there. And of course the dog, upon seeing the food, would begin to salivate. But what Pavlov noticed is if he did this a lot, if he did this during what is called conditioning, which is basically training, sooner or later the dog is going to begin to associate the fact that the bell and the food always show up at the same time. You don't see one without the other. And so after the dog has been properly conditioned, after it's been properly trained in this method, what Pavlov discovered he could do is he could ring the bell, which is now a conditioned stimulus, CS here. So the dog would see the bell, and now the dog would actually begin to salivate. You'll notice there's no food here. So no food. So even when there was no food, the dog would still salivate. It's now producing a conditioned response, whereas before there was no response for salivation at all to this. This is classic conditioning. The association of an unconditioned stimulus, in this case the food, with a neutral stimulus, the bell, to produce a conditioned response, salivation in this case. You'll sometimes see this if you are a dog owner as well with dogs, for instance, when you try to go and take them for a walk. If they know when you go to get that leash that they're going to go for a walk, they'll probably do that little happy dance they do because they've associated the leash, the neutral stimulus, to the unconditioned stimulus of going for a walk, and their response is to get all happy and excited. So you do see this in many other species, but this is the classic way by which it was initially described. Another example of classical conditioning that actually was experimented on in humans is what's called the Baby Albert experiments. Now this was done in the 1940s or 50s, I believe, and what they basically did is the scientists had this baby and they would bang a piece of metal over its head, make a loud noise. So that is the unconditioned stimulus, and then the baby's natural response was to be afraid, to cry, to try and run away. It was fearful of the loud noise. Now that makes sense. Then they tried to introduce a neutral stimulus. Basically they put in a stuffed rat. I don't believe it was a live rat. They put in a white stuffed lab rat. And the baby's natural response after a while was certainly not to feel fear. It soon became habituated to this. There was no real response to seeing the stuffed rat. Then they began the conditioning. And what they did was, again, they put the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus for a long time together. So they would show the rat, and then they would bang the piece of metal above the baby's head, and of course the baby would react with fear, be afraid. And they would do this a lot, to the point where after conditioning had completed, the baby, upon just seeing the rat, without hearing any noise at all, would suddenly be afraid. That is classical conditioning. And again, the initial description of classical conditioning comes from dogs, but we know this also applies to humans. It is a basic system for some dog trainers, but we'll talk about another system used. But yeah, you can see here this dog, switch my colors here. This dog is definitely drooling at the sight of the food, but you'll also notice it's not going after the food. It's been trained through another type of learning called operant conditioning about when it's allowed to go after the food, which has been done by some form of trainer. Now, operant conditioning is a bit different. Operant conditioning almost always involves some kind of consequence and the ability, the inclusion of choice, I should say. This is when an animal makes a mental connection, let's do this in yellow here, mental connection, and chooses, keyword here, to behave in a certain way through repeated practice in either to receive a reward or avoid punishment. Operant conditioning obviously can be seen in humans. If you have any experience with any type of teacher who does a reward system in kindergarten or middle school, they may have done a currency system. That's operant conditioning. They are giving you a reward to reinforce certain behaviors. So operant conditioning focuses on strengthening certain behaviors or perhaps weakening other behaviors, and all these behaviors are voluntary. The animal has conscious control. And you can see in this second picture here, this is a Skinner box. I've mentioned these before, hopefully in class. They were initially designed by a scientist named B.F. Skinner. He's the one who's credited with describing in detail operant conditioning. And there'll be a bit of explanation for how these Skinner box works, but you'll notice there is a food dispenser here that would serve as a reward system. There's an electrical grid running underneath the rodent here that would serve as a punishment system. And there's a series of lights, a speaker, and there's a lever for the rodent to push. So the Skinner box was initially designed to teach rats how to push a lever. This is not a natural behavior in rats. No rat inherently knows how to push a lever. So what Skinner did was he began to condition these things using positive and negative reinforcement systems. The positive reinforcement system was the food. The negative reinforcement system was the electric shock. So what the rats would eventually quickly learn after conditioning is that by pushing on the lever, they may either be rewarded with a positive reinforcement, food, or rewarded with a negative reinforcement, which was usually turning off this electric grid so they could stop the electricity from flowing under their feet and making them uncomfortable. So what Skinner was doing with the Skinner box was using positive and negative types of reinforcement. This was a way to increase behavior. Remember, he wanted to increase the frequency with which the rats learned how to push on the lever, something they naturally couldn't do. He did this through positive reinforcement by adding food to the Skinner box. So in his experiment, pushing the lever produced a food pellet. He did this through negative reinforcement as well by subtracting something from the rat's environment. He subtracted the electricity. So by pushing the lever, the rat turned off the electricity. That subtracts something to increase behavior. Now with humans, for your personal experience, if, for instance, your parents ever give you any type of allowance increase for instance, having good grades, that is a positive reinforcement to try and increase your behavior towards getting good grades. There can also be a negative reinforcement where, for instance, perhaps they decrease the number of chores you have to do for some good behavior they feel needs to be rewarded. So both of these work towards increasing behavior. It's just sometimes you're adding something and sometimes you're subtracting something. Now, he also described this other alternative, which he called punishment. Now, punishment is designed to decrease behavior. And again, you can have positive punishment where you're adding something, or you can have negative punishment where you're subtracting something. Now, for positive punishment, for instance, for your experience, perhaps, again, based upon behavior, maybe your parents add more chores. For negative punishment, for instance, taking something away, for instance, they might say you've now been limited to cell phone use, so they might take away your cell phone if there's a behavior they don't want to see continue. So punishment is designed to decrease behavior. You can either add things or subtract things, and that's positive or negative punishment. Reinforcement is designed to increase behavior. Again, you can either add things or subtract things, and that's positive and negative reinforcement. So when it comes down to it, there's two ways you can distinguish between operant and classical conditioning. With operant conditioning, Skinner's work on the rats showed that the rat is choosing to push the lever. So there is a choice thing going on here. And again, there's a reward and a punishment. There's a consequence to this. With classical conditioning, Pavlov showed that the dog is not really thinking too much about the association. It just automatically associates the bell to the food. So there's no choice, and there's no issue of punishment or reinforcement being displayed here usually. So that's two ways you can distinguish between operant conditioning and classical conditioning, and both are used in dog training, for instance, both systems. So it's not limited to one type of conditioning to one type of animal. No, both can be present in the same species very easily. The next type of learning we're going to talk about is what's called insight learning, and this is probably one of the more complicated types of learning. This is when an animal applies something it already learned to a completely new or novel situation. Now, this experiment shows this gorilla trying to reach, I believe it's a food item, but you can't quite see it. It looks like a bunch of bananas there. And then using these boxes to build itself a platform by which it can do this. Now, we'll see this experiment in action in class through a video, but it is a very complicated system where you, again, apply something you already learned. In this case, the gorilla, or excuse me, the chimpanzee here, not gorilla, the chimpanzee has to apply its knowledge of boxes to this new situation where it can't reach its food in order to try and solve a situation. Another type of learned behavior that's a bit weird is imprinting. Imprinting is a form of learned behavior that occurs at a very specific and crucial period of time. So it's very specific. And this was originally described by Konrad Lorenz, though others had mentioned this before, but he's usually the one who gets credited with this. And it allows for the forming of a social attachment to an object or an individual. Usually it's an individual, but it can be manipulated to be just an object. We know, for instance, birds, geese especially, will begin imprinting within a day or two of hatching. At that critical time, they will imprint on the nearest thing to them that they perceive to be a parent, even if it's not the same species. So you can have situations where people have raised flocks of geese, ducks, whatever, and the geese, ducks have imprinted on this person as a parental figure, and once imprinting occurs, it's usually irreversible. So it cannot ever be changed for these geese or duck. They will always perceive this person as their parental figure. These goslings will always perceive this, these ducklings will always perceive this duck as their parental figure. It will never, ever change to that. And I do have a link in the video here that talks about ways that scientists have experimented with imprinting. Again, this was done early in the 50s before a bit of ethical standards were in there. And there is also a video, I believe, on Konrad Lorenz's original experiments on imprinting with geese as well. So next up, we're going to talk about some behavioral cycles. That is to say, behaviors that follow environmental changes. These tend to be cyclical, so they tend to repeat themselves. Migration is a very good example of cyclical behavioral cycles where the seasonal changes will cause some species to go from very northern latitudes to southern latitudes. Of course, you can talk about the migration patterns of things like the monarch butterfly, of your standard birds, which in some cases take 2 generations for the entire migration cycle to complete. Of course, we have many species of ungulates in Africa that are constantly migrating. Reindeer, for instance, in Alaska always have to be migrating so that they can find access to the best grasses. So when the environment changes, you see this change in migratory patterns as well. Birds, of course, migrate all the time during the seasonal changes. But there's also circadian behaviors that come about, of course, the idea of sleep. So this is the circadian rhythm in humans. You can see here by 6:30 p.m. is typically when we see the highest blood pressure recordings in humans. The highest body temperature is about 7. The melatonin starts to increase in your body by about 9 p.m. We know that does get affected, though, by the amount of artificial light that's available. So this is typically in a classical situation where you don't have all that much artificial light on at night. Melatonin secretion typically is what helps put you to sleep. The deepest amount of sleep typically happens at about 2 a.m. Lowest body temperature, I've talked about the fact that body temperature does fluctuate a little bit in mammals. With humans, it's at about 4:30 a.m. when your body temperature is at its lowest. You see the sharpest rise in blood pressure at 6:45 a.m. when you're trying to start to wake up. The melatonin secretion stops at about 7:30. Again, this is all averaged out over many different studies of different people. The highest alertness, again, this is based upon adults, not necessarily teenagers, but highest alertness comes at about 10 a.m. And then the best coordination comes about 2:30 p.m., fastest reaction time by about 3:30, and the greatest efficiency in both cardiovascular and muscular strength by about 5 p.m. in humans. So next up, we're going to be talking about some courtship behaviors. Now, I did mention courtship when we talked about ecology, I believe, in the fall semester, so I won't spend too much time on this. These are ritualistic behaviors regarding mating that shows the overall health of potential mates, typically of the male of the species, but not always. Of course, you have your classic peacock mating posture here for courtship. The males, of course, have these lovely vibrant colors on their feathers to show their overall health, while, of course, the females are in a much drabber color, but they are the ones who are actually choosing the mates. With many lizards and reptiles, I should say, and bird species, there's this little thing here called the dewlap to help also show its vibrant colors, its overall health system. You can see certain behaviors in both birds and lizards. You recall, I believe I showed you guys the jumping birds in Africa that jump very high for very long periods of time to show their overall health in attracting the mates. You can find this both with mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians in some cases. So it's not limited to any particular mammal group, or excuse me, any particular animal group. You also find this in invertebrates, especially with things like octopi or cuttlefish that can show colorations in some cases. So any type of sound or physical movement, even a dance, a song, a chemical cue, anything that can send out a stimulus to project the overall health of the male, usually to the female. Again, it's not always that way, but that projects health of potential mates can be considered part of a courtship ritual. Another one that we mentioned before with ecology is competition. Now, competition, of course, happens when animals are competing over certain resources, but the term resources is rather broad. So this could be food, territory, or even access to mates. Now, many species, especially the ungulate species here, have very ritualized competition systems to where fighting is by no means the first option. It's usually the last option. That is to say, they'll often prance around each other, they'll do a basic assessment of each other, they'll often circle each other to see if there's a clear difference in their overall physical fitness. Then, if there is no clear difference, it escalates a bit further, and then eventually fighting might occur. Most of these competition systems will actually end before any fighting typically occurs. Fighting actually tends to be a bit rarer. And oftentimes it's only seasonal as well. It's only when the females of the species are ready for breeding. And of course you can find this in other ungulates such as rams, but again, these things will have very ritualized systems to where they won't actually come to butting heads until they've gone through this assessment type process where they circulate each other, try to see if there's a clear disparity between which of the two is more physically fit before they actually begin any physical competition. So next up, we're going to talk about social behavior. This is where animals frequently interact with other members of their own species for the purposes of hunting, grazing, sheltering together. So sheltering should be in here as well. This, of course, would improve the chances for survival and or reproduction. This would also include things like the insects, which work in a colony system where only the queen reproduces, technically, but this still does increase the chance for reproduction overall since the genes are passed on through the queen. Now, in cases of mammals, typically, we know that, for instance, meerkats, because of their intense socialization with one another, they actually have words. Not necessarily a language, but words that they can use to signal towards one another. They have certain types of warning calls for certain types of predators. We actually know this is true also for something even less akin to having that amount of socialization. Chickens will also have words for certain types of warning calls for certain types of predators to signal whether the predator is, for instance, a bird species, a snake species, or a standard like canine species or a cat species. Other social systems that probably also use words in terms of how they talk, not I say talk, but how they can communicate to one another would be things like parrots, which live in large colonies. Elephants, we know, will communicate with one another over vast distances in some cases. Whales, we know from a lot of research, actually will live in rather large pods and can communicate over very far distances where you don't think they're in one pod by themselves, even though they're separated by like 20 miles, but they can still talk to one another. So they're in kind of a loose-knit group. And of course, dolphins. Dolphins are interesting in the fact that not only do they have words, we also know that they have, in fact, names for one another. And the dolphin language is so complex, we can't translate it. We have no basis for comparison, but we do know that they use certain sounds to signal certain individuals when they hunt, when they're trying to coordinate hunts. So they can, in fact, recognize one another through calling each other's names. So communication behaviors are often associated with social behaviors. Thus, we tend to see the most complicated communication behaviors in social animals, though you can find them in somewhat non-social animals as well. Even solitary creatures like tigers will communicate with one another through their scents and leaving scent markings and using of their musk glands in their face. So when we convey information from one animal to another, that's basic communication, whether it is in a social animal or not. It's just that the social animals tend to have a higher degree of complexity with their communication systems. Keep in mind this can apply to things like ants, bees, termites, squid, octopi, dolphins, whales, elephants, anything that's going to live in a social group of any type is probably going to have a decent form of communication and maybe a pretty complex form in the case of, especially with dolphins here. The communication itself can be either visual, chemical, auditory, or it can in fact be a type of language if we've studied it enough to determine it's a language. Language is obviously the most complex system. We know, for instance, bees will communicate visually to one another through doing a specific dance. They're also, in the case of ants especially, and termites, will communicate chemically through smells. Squid and octopi will communicate visually through one another since they usually can't generate too much sound, but they can generate a few clicks here and there, but usually it's more of a visual communication. Whales use sound a lot, and there's many species of whales, bigger species of whales, that we're discovering that they actually live in pods, but they're very loose-knit. So they're like the overall group is spread out over like a 20 or 100-mile radius, and they're communicating across that distance to where classically we didn't think of them as being certain species being that particularly sociable. They are, in fact, communicating over these vast distances, thus they are a bit more social than we initially thought. We know elephants will communicate with individuals amongst one another. And, of course, dolphins, as I said, Dolphins will have, in fact, names for one another that they can use to identify individuals, and they'll often do this when they're hunting, so they can coordinate a hunting strategy when they're hunting for fish, so they can tell one individual go this way or go that way or circle around and come back and do all this stuff, so that they're clear not to run into each other and everybody is playing their part in setting up for success in a hunt. Keep in mind, we have bred some animals to be more social than they are even in nature. Canines overall are highly social with one another. Wolves, coyotes, hyenas are all highly social, usually physically, visually I should say, and through a sense of smell with one another. We've bred dogs, for instance, not only exaggerate this level of communication, but to also recognize our own cues from communicating with us, so they can often recognize our own expressions. And as a result, yeah, you can see certain behavioral recognition through communication in dog species, even when we don't intend to. So for instance, you take the dog out in the car when it actually perceives the car to not necessarily just be a car, but to actually be a nice joyride. So yeah, we have bred the ability for some animals to actually have the ability to communicate with us, and we've done experiments with some animals that have not been bred to see how well they can actually communicate with us, and I will show you guys a video about this in class.